Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you can tap or mouse over the video playback area of the screen to reveal the chapter titles and starting points of each section. In this week's video, I have tidbits. I have a finished sewing project. I have a knitting work in progress where I tried out a technique that I learned about from one of you. I have some new to me vintage knitting books. I have a bit of Q&A, and those Q's are from me and the A's are from you. So let's get started. My first tidbit came to me, I think, from my Twitter feed. It's the opportunity to watch somebody doing some hand spinning using a spinning wheel as sort of a performative part of her Master's of Fine Art degree. So I will leave a link below to the YouTube channel. She's doing it for 2 hours, 2 weeks in a row. So one is actually happening right now as I'm recording this. I saw the very beginning of it before I started recording. But it's an opportunity to watch somebody spin if you want to see that. She won't be talking. She'll just be spinning. So if you've never seen anybody do hand spinning, it's a chance to just watch them for as long as you want, uninterrupted. But I will leave the link down below. It's from 1 to 3, which is Central Daylight Time. Today, which by the time you see this, it will be done, but also next Friday, April 23rd. The next tidbit came from one of you through I believe a direct message, or it may have been a post in my Ravelry group. I can't remember. It is the online International Fiber Festival. It's going to be taking place May 1st to 8th. You do have to register, but it's free to register, and you can then see more about it. So it brings the experience of a fiber festival to your own home using online resources. The 8 regions that they're going to be doing, they're going to be doing one region each day, May 1st to May 8th. And that is going to be the American South, the Atlantic Canada, Norway, Poland, Cornwall in England, Italy, Bulgaria, and Morocco. So those are the 8 areas. So it's going to be a combination of documentary, so you can learn more about that region. It's going to be projects that you could do. It's going to be recipes that they get from various online sources. Then there's also going to be some entertainment at the end of each day. So there's an opportunity to kind of take part in a community-based thing. You can pick and choose what it is you want. So the classes that they're going to have are Craftsy classes. Now Craftsy does have some free classes, and I don't know which ones for any particular day might happen to be free. They usually, from what I looked at, there's usually 3 or 4 different classes that you could pick in a particular day that you might do, and you can see what the materials are. Sometimes the idea is that you can use whatever it is you have at home in order to make this project. You can be a Craftsy subscriber without being a paid subscriber. So then in that way, then you could do some free classes. And then the documentaries, some will be YouTube and some will be through, it's called Curiosity Stream, which is a channel on Amazon Prime. So it's a separate paid subscription add-on to Amazon Prime, but you can get 1 week free trial if you already are an Amazon Prime subscriber. So there are opportunities to do things as low cost as possible. I believe there are also vendors who will be selling various different yarns and things if that's something that you're interested in. So I will leave a link below to, there's a short video that explains what it is, and then their website as well if that's something that you might want to participate in. This tidbit came to me through my Twitter feed, and it is a link to a museum, the Aberdeen Art Gallery Museums, and it's a collection of different paintings that depict women knitting. Some of them are knitting alone, some of them are knitting in groups, some of them are lower class women who are knitting for work to earn money, and some of them are women who are obviously in a higher social class and knitting is a leisure activity. This next tidbit came to me either in my Twitter feed or Instagram feed. This is an online event. It is the 5th event of the 19th Century Dress and Textiles Reframed Network. So there's going to be 3 short talks. They're going to be 10 minutes apiece, and then there is going to be time for questions and answers. So the first topic is by Emily Gallagher, The Artistic Depiction and Preservation of Victorian Working Class Dress. Very seldom do you see working class dress shown in a museum, and that's typically because it got worn and worn and worn and worn and it was worn out, and so there's nothing left. So what you tend to see in museums is the fancy stuff. This is a collection of garments that an artist had that he would have his subjects dress in when he was painting portraits, and that is likely the reason why it was well preserved. So that's the first one. The second one is by a different Emily, Emily Taylor, and it's Collecting of Men, Materials, and Myths. This short talk will introduce a selection of men's fashionable dress items in the collection of the National Museum Scotland that complicate Flugel's received ideas, examining the material reality of 19th century men against prevailing narratives of masculinity. It will question the role of museum collections in directing and perpetuating social mythologies. And then the third one is going to be presented by Kimberly Lamb, Behind the Scenes, Elizabeth Keckley's Written Garments and the Fabrication of Black Interiority. This paper will examine Elizabeth Keckley's Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House, which tells the story of how Keckley's experience in slavery led to her position as the modiste for Mary Todd Lincoln. Like always, I will leave a link below so you can register. That's a free event through Eventbrite in case you are interested. I saved the best for last. In my opinion, this is the best. This came to me through the Wool Channel. I've been talking about this past few weeks. Clara Parks, who's an expert on wool, started this website called the Wool Channel, and you can either sign up for a free weekly newsletter and see what's going on in wool news, or you can pay an $8 a month or $89 per year subscription and have access to the whole community and other things. So you can actually talk with other people who are deeply interested in wool and ask questions, or just read about things, find out about things, events or websites or programs or all kinds of things that people will post there. So what I saw was a post by a woman named Lilly Marsh, who said that she was being interviewed for this 8-part podcast series. Yarns at Yin-Hu is the name of the podcast. And the 8-part series is about Elizabeth Zimmermann. So Lilly Marsh, the woman who posted this on the Wool Channel, got her PhD in American Studies back in 2016 from Purdue University. And the topic was Elizabeth Zimmermann and the Emergence of Critical Knitting. And really, she talks about what she means is that in terms of critical thinking in knitting and Elizabeth Zimmermann's impact on the knitting world, which lasts up to today. Each part in the series kind of tackles a particular part of Elizabeth's life or a particular aspect of the work that she did. And the first episode kind of lays the foundation of who Elizabeth was, where she came from, how she learned to knit, and how she got started on her journey to communicating with knitters in a very different way than had been done previously. So I have seen the first, or I've heard, that's an audio podcast. I've listened to the first 4, and I just saw a post today that the 5th one is available. So they're coming out about every week to week and a half, I believe. The podcaster's alternating them with her regular podcast. And it's just been super interesting. I'm really enjoying it a lot. I have a finished object this week. It's a sewing project. It's a project I found down in my craft room that it had to have been down there for at least 7 years, if not longer. And all it is a pair of pajama bottoms, and all that needed was to be hemmed. That was it. when I took a look at them, I didn't even know who I had made these for. I thought I must have made them for one of my kids or something. They fit me. In fact, they're kind of roomy even for me. One of the things that I noticed when I looked on the inside was that I had used my serger to do the seams. So I'd bought this serger when my daughter was in figure skating, and I thought it would save money to make some of her figure skating outfits, which had to be very stretchy and really needed a serger for it. I was kind of learning how to sew and use it. And when I decided to bring my sewing up to this room, and I was watching a lot of sewing videos, I saw all of these ways of using your regular sewing machine to do some of the things that sergers do. And I thought, well, I'm not going to bring my serger up. I'll just learn to really use my sewing machine to do that kind of thing. If only I'd known that, I might never have bought a serger to begin with. So I looked on the inside of these and I thought, boy, those look so nice. the surged seams, that really looks great. I did bring the serger up. I still haven't hooked it up to see if it's still working. It might need maintenance after sitting for so long. I do plan on using the serger since I have it, as long as it functions. So all I had to do was turn up the bottoms and hem them. And while I was doing that, I noticed that, boy, the tension on at the beginning was like really wonky, and why is this not working? I had just opened it up a few weeks ago and tried it out for the first time since it had been maintained, and it sewed beautifully. I was so excited. But in the process of doing all of this reorganization and figuring out how I was going to store my sewing machine and then put it on this cart and bring it out and adjusting the shelves on that cart and getting everything figured out, I'd taken my sewing machine on and off that cart many times, and there's a little knob that had popped up, and it controls the presser foot and how much pressure is on there. And so I pushed that knob down and everything worked better, but I didn't really know how to use that knob. Luckily, a couple of years ago, I would search for the sewing machine manual for my sewing machine, which had been lost probably in 1986 when the machine was pretty new. I'd never been able to find a copy of it online, and I found a few years ago, I found that somebody had scanned it and it was there, and so I downloaded it. I now have a copy of my manual. So I went through and I looked at, what is that knob like? How do you control it? Like, I knew that when I pushed it down, everything worked, but I didn't really know what I had done. And so it's so nice to have a manual where you can look things up for your specific machine. And it's really nice to have the internet to turn to with videos or questions or whatever and it's just making such a difference. So I'm taking these little baby steps with my sewing. I thought, well, the first thing to do would be to finish something that I started a long time ago. So I did that. And now I have a new pair of pajamas that I think are really going to be very, very roomy. But one of the things I am learning about sewing is how to really read the pattern back and then how to determine where you can modify it. That's something I'd never known how to do with sewing patterns. And I didn't used to know how to do that with knitting patterns either. But now I've learned how to modify knitting patterns and kind of really figure out what I needed. And so now I'll be able to do that with sewing patterns as well. So last week I had started a sock it's a plain old, I would call it a plain vanilla sock for my brother. So I'd been doing all this reorganizing. I was taking a little break from my 1960s sweater to figure out what I was going to do with it. But I wasn't knitting much, so I'd started this sock. I finished the first one, but one of the things I wanted to do was to try out a technique that somebody had linked to, a YouTube video to, I don't know, a month or so ago, maybe 2 months ago. And it's a video that's in Danish, but it's not that hard to actually follow along. So I tried out that technique at the corners of the heels, because that's always the place where people can get holes. I have a really good technique when I do heel flap and gusset. I have a good technique for when I'm doing the thumbs of a mitten that has a gusset, but I really struggle with getting a consistently good technique for other types of openings where you're rejoining and working with stitches that were already there. So I thought, I'm going to try this one. I have some things that work okay for me. They don't work in a nice enough way for me to want to demonstrate it and try to explain it to people. I'm trying, I've been trying to find something that works really well. And I think that this works really well on the heel. So I'm going to do an overhead so that you can see what the result looks like. So I have a little bit of a gusset here because I needed to add room for my brother's foot. But this is that corner. There's no hole. I think the yarn tail is actually hanging here where I joined the yarn. So I can tighten this up a little bit. I have to weave in that end. So that looks perfectly fine. And then on this side, it looks great too. So there really isn't a hole there. And it's a pretty simple technique that somebody posted a link to in my Ravelry group a couple of months ago. And I thought when I started knitting these socks, I was going to try it. The video is actually demonstrating how to deal with the holes at the underarm corners when you have to pick up stitches for a sweater that's like a yoke style sweater or a raglan style. But it's the same type of situation. It takes a little bit of finessing in a slightly different way for sock heels. And so I will probably do a video on this technique sometime in the near future, very near future. But I'm going to leave a link to the technique as it's demonstrated in Danish for the underarms. I didn't need to understand the words in order to understand what she was doing. So if you have done underarm, if you have done that style of sweater where you had to pick up stitches along that underarm and you've had problems with holes, you will probably be able to follow that video just fine. I want to talk a little bit about a vintage magazine, a couple of vintage booklets, and a vintage book. Most of them are new to me in the past week. One of them is one I had around, but I looked at it with fresh eyes based on that podcast about Elizabeth Zimmermann. Before I show you the vintage books that are new to me, I wanted to show you one that I've had in my collection for a long time. This is Vogue Knitting from the fall, winter of 1961. So this magazine is older than I have, and I have looked through this several times. This had been my grandmother's, so when my grandmother died and I went through all of her knitting things, I took all of her vintage knitting patterns, all of her tools, her knitting bag, everything that was knitting related, I took with me. And I have looked through this book several times, but I looked through it in order to see if there were any instructions about knitting techniques in this particular magazine. And you can see I had a post-it note here. So I have used this to see what sorts of information that they may have given about basic knitting techniques. In particular, I was interested in things like seaming. So I looked at it for that purpose, but I didn't really look at any of the patterns or look to read the articles. So after I had heard that first podcast about Elizabeth Zimmermann, where they talked about Vogue knitting, they talked about what knitting books were like back in the mid-century. One of the things that they had mentioned about Vogue knitting was that there weren't any articles. It was all knitting patterns. So I went back and looked through this to see if that was actually true. Was that true in 1961? Because I didn't know specifically what they might have meant about mid-century. Was it earlier than that, or did it continue through there? So again, there are some knitting terms here and abbreviations, there is something that talks about the needles and hooks, but there are no articles other than talking about the fashion, the silhouette of the fall of 1961. So these are all knitting patterns. That's what this magazine is full of. So I thought that was interesting. I was so happy that I actually had a copy of one of those magazines to be able to look at. One of the other publications that Lilly Marsh talked about was this particular book called Knit to Fit. Now, because of my interest in 20th century knitting manuals, I was in particular interested to get my hands on this book because it is really difficult. It's particularly in certain decades to find out what was actually being instructed. Like if you wanted to learn to knit or if you wanted to learn to modify things or to design for yourself, what sorts of publications were available. So I was very interested in this, and I've started reading it. I'm already on page 50 so far. But in some ways, it's like a textbook, or it's a guide in any rate, about how to go about measuring a specific person and how to decide how to shape that sweater, and going through the whole process. And she has tasks for you to do, like do this thing, and then apparently there's answers in the back, which I have not looked at. She tells you don't peek at the back, wait until you get your answers, and then you can look in the back, and there'll be information about frequent mistakes that people might make. So this is it's just like a gold mine for me. And it's got some really good information about how to measure and how to knit to fit, but it's done in the context of what the fashion was at that time. This was published in 1963. So for example, she hasn't mentioned anything about ease, like adding additional room over the body measurement. It's like, take this body measurement and now we're going to knit to that body measurement, which I find interesting. So it's still really informative, and it's not that expensive a book, but it's a really informative peek at how this process was approached in the 60s and how it really wasn't aimed at the home knitter. This was aimed at professional knitters, either teaching, designing, whatever, but it really wasn't aimed at the home knitter. So this is a pattern booklet that came to me from one of my YouTube subscribers, Ria, who lives in Canada, and she has been coming to our Knitting Guild's virtual meetings as well. So I've gotten to kind of know her, but she asked me if I would be interested in this booklet, and I said sure. And so she sent it to me, and I was really interested. First of all, I don't think I'd heard of Regent before. If I'd heard of it, I'd never seen. I don't have any booklets that are Regent. I believe this is a Canadian company. And so this booklet is from the 1940s, and it has sort of those very typical 1940s style patterns where you have a lot of like color block work, which is known as intarsia. So this type of knitting is typically done by knitting flat. So you'd have to knit the sock leg flat and then seam it later. And sometimes when these patterns go down into the sock, then you have a seam coming down the side as well until it goes into a solid color when it can be knit in the round. So that is very typical of the 1940s. But as I started to look through this booklet, and I saw some of these patterns. These two in particular, just there's something about the way they looked visually that made me take a second look. So if you ever knit in intarsia, you might think, well, this looks somehow a little bit different than you'd normally expect intarsia to look. And so I looked to see if there was a clue in the instructions that would let me know if I'd guessed right about the construction method. And what these say, that these are seamless interlocked diamond pattern socks. And what they mean by that is that normally color block knitting like this is done flat, so that you would end up with a seam up the back. You'd have to sew it closed. But this uses a technique where you don't have to do that. And in fact, it's quite different from standard intarsia or color block knitting in that you only ever have one color in play at a given time. It's a really interesting and clever technique. If you have seen my Technique Tuesday video on mock short row heels, it's a very similar concept in that you are shaping these with decreases and then picking stitches up when you are using a different color. So it's a process of decreasing and increasing and using one color at a time, which is really interesting. And there are a number of patterns in this book that use this technique. This is one of them right here. This is Seamless Interlock Diamond Pattern Socks. And then you get to these, and these are just standard color blocks. So these are going to have a seam up the back, and these are going to have a couple of balls of each color used for each row. so that you would knit across all of the stitches back and forth like you would for typical intarsia. So they have both techniques used in this particular pattern book. And so it's a technique that I am interested in trying out and comparing, like doing the same pattern using traditional intarsia methods, using this this seamless method, and trying and comparing that to a couple of other methods of working intarsia in the round without seams. So it's going to be a really interesting experiment. So this is the first time I have seen one of these mid-century pattern books for socks that included women's stockings. Like these are knee socks, but also above the knee stockings. This is the first time I've seen that. I'm sure that they were in many other booklets, but none of the ones I have had that. They've either been little anklet tennis socks or men's socks. I have never seen these women's stockings in a mid-century sock book, so that was a really cool thing to see as well. This is the other booklet that was sent to me again by another Canadian who, Mary Maxim is a Canadian company, and she sent this to me and said this had been her mother-in-law's pattern. It has two patterns. It has this cardigan and then which has buttons on it, and then it's this sort of just open front jacket here. And what's interesting about both of these is that these embellishments here are embroidered, and so there's information on the inside about how to do that. So these patterns are actually available on the Mary Maxim website. I think it's like $1 or $2 or something to buy these. But it was really interesting. I'm so happy she sent it. But what was even more interesting was the note that she wrote about her mother-in-law, who had owned this pattern and obviously had taken care of it. This is from the early 60s. You can tell from the hairstyles and also the fashion. So this pattern is 60 years old and it's in pretty good shape. So I want to tell you the story about the woman who owned that Mary Maxim pattern. So Michelle, who is her daughter-in-law, is just learning to knit herself, but she is in possession of this knitting pattern that had belonged to her mother-in-law. She wanted to give it a good home, and she thought that I would really appreciate it, and I truly do. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about the woman who originally owned the pattern. The pattern belonged to Reiko, second-generation Japanese-Canadian. As a young girl, she was interned during the war. They had their family fishing trawler taken away and 24 hours to pack one bag each. I think this experience taught her to care for things and to not collect too much. As you can tell, this pattern is over 40 years old. It's actually 60 years old. And it looks not bad for the years. My mother-in-law was a very kind, generous woman. She would be happy knowing that someone who appreciates knitting patterns has her old pattern. She also might not understand why you would like her old pattern, but she would be pleased. Thank you, enjoy. And I couldn't be more pleased to receive that. It's just such a gift. And I think the story that comes with that vintage pattern is more precious to me even than the pattern itself. I think a lot of times when I buy vintage patterns, or if somebody sends me vintage patterns, I love them, and I really love the signs that a person has actually used the pattern. If I see the little notes that they've written, I can see the sign that another knitter has been there. But I've never really known the stories behind the people who've owned them, except for the patterns that I got when my grandmother died. So it's a real pleasure to have that Mary Maxim pattern, and for Michelle to think of me and to think that I would enjoy having it, because I really do. So last week I asked you guys some questions and I got answers from you. One of the questions I had was, would you guys be interested in a live stream on short rows? And there was an overwhelming response to that. And so people have been telling me the kinds of things that they would be interested in learning about. Now, short rows is a fairly large topic, so I probably won't be able to cover everything, but I will be covering some of it. And I will let you know very soon when I will be scheduling that live stream. So that will happen very, very soon. Last week, I asked you guys if any of you knew what this little package of notions were. I suspected that they might be for my knitting machine, but maybe for my serger. And many of you responded that these are used with a knitting machine and the intarsia carriage. So intarsia is color block knitting. And so these are sometimes somehow used with each of the different colors you might use. I had been able to figure out what this needle was called. I'd never seen a bent needle like this before. And so I was able to Google this based on the description, but I hadn't been able to figure out with a reverse Google images what this was. So the name of this particular type of needle is called a mattress needle. And obviously that is not related to intarsia knitting. However, I think that this is used to help thread yarn through this little device, and I'm guessing through here, that you could stick this needle in through here and then pull the yarn through in some way. I have to track down my manual to see how it's actually used. I don't recall ever using these previously, so that's interesting. But this is really interesting, and I will be talking a little bit later about what mattress needles are used for in other contexts. This week's question to you guys is related to my technique video that I published on Tuesday. So in that video, I was showing how to hand wash sweaters. And I was showing different options, but I was also showing how to block them, how to store them, and then how to take action to prevent moth damage with your sweaters. One of the things that I mentioned in that video was that I used to have an old top-loading washing machine. It's the kind, it was 36 years old when it died in November, and it's an agitating kind, so it had that pole in the center. So when it was washing, it would go back and forth like this, but when it was spinning the water out, it would just start spinning, and all of the items would get thrown to the sides of the wall. They wouldn't be swirling past each other. As the water was drained out, they would just get sucked to the side, sort of like those carnival rides where you're in the cylinder and it spins and spins around and you get sucked to the back and then they drop the floor, but you don't fall. Same kind of thing. So that was a fantastic way to hand wash sweaters because I could just fill up that tub, put some soap in, I turn off the machine. It wasn't agitating, but I could soak them, and then it was really easy to extract the water, and then I could just lay them flat to dry. We got this new front loader in November, and it has a lot of options. You can do custom loads, you can download things to the washing machine. And one of the things that I was delighted to see was that it had a spin-only cycle, and I had tried it out. I had done a load of laundry, was going to put it in the dryer, and like, this stuff still feels awfully heavy. And I saw that there was a spin only cycle. And so I ran it through and it took a lot more water out and I put them in the dryer. So in late November, I think probably early December, I was getting ready to send a sweater I had knit for my daughter. I had washed it, I'd blocked it. I had talked to you guys about it, I'd shown it to you, I'd taken photos. And I had folded it up and I was putting it in a big Ziploc bag before putting it in the package, and I saw that there was a stain on the shoulder. And this was knit top down, so I hadn't really seen the top of the sweater in quite a long time. In addition, I had shipped it to my daughter when it was halfway done for her to try. I had picked it up from her apartment in Chicago on my way to Michigan in the fall. So it had been in 3 states, it had been shipped around. And I don't know when that stain happened, and I don't know what it was. And so I thought maybe it was some sort of grease. I tried just washing it the way I would normally wash it. Nothing happened. I tried spot treating it with some Dawn dish detergent so that would take the grease out. It didn't work. And so it was soaking wet, and I was doing more research, and I saw some research on mineral spirits can take grease out of wool, but it needed to be dry, and the sweater was super wet, and I thought, oh, the new washing machine can run a spin-only cycle. So I took it down there. I started it up. It said it was going to take 13 minutes. And I went upstairs and I was, doing various different things. And as I mentioned in the past couple of weeks about reorganizing, I have selective attention. I get very focused on whatever it is I'm doing, and I forget everything else. And the little app on my phone that tells me a load of laundry is done hadn't gone off. And I looked at the clock and I was like, geez, it's been like a half hour, 45 minutes. And I looked at the phone and it still said I had 13 minutes to go. And I'm like, well, is it not working? Is it off? I went down there and it was tossing my sweater around. My washing machine cannot do a load with a single item in it because it does all this stuff to prevent the load from not being balanced. And so it tosses things around for a while until it thinks everything's going to be balanced, and then it'll spin, and then it might toss things around to get a little bit again. So it had been tossing that sweater around for a half hour to 45 minutes. And I stopped it. I opened it up. There was no difference in how much water was in it. It hadn't done any spinning. And it felt a little denser to me, but I couldn't tell because it was wet, and I was so afraid that it had shrunk. And I was just like, oh. So I rolled it up in towels, took the water out, let it dry until it was dry. And then I kept reading about these mineral spirits, and they're like, well, there's odorless mineral spirits. And so I went to the hardware store, got odorless mineral spirits. And I said, is it really odorless? And they're like, not so much. And so then I was reading all these articles about how hard it is to get the smell of mineral spirits out of clothing. And so at this point, I realized that the sweater had slightly shrunk. It was a little bit smaller than it had been. It would probably still fit her. I had a stain on it. And if I treated it with mineral spirits, and whether it got the stain out or not, then it might be smelling like mineral spirits. So I told my daughter the problem, and she's not going anywhere. She works from home. Nobody can see her in a Zoom call. They can't see her shoulders. So I sent it to her so she could at least wear it for the rest of the winter. But in the meantime, I'm like, there's no way I'm going to wash one of my wool sweaters in the front loader. And I got a lot of comments on the Tuesday video from people said, oh, you can use the spin cycle, or you can do this, or I always wash my sweaters in the washing machine. And I'm like, clearly not all washing machines are the same. They have different functionalities. So my question is to those of you who A, have a front-loading washing machine, B, wash their wool sweaters in the washing machine, C, those wool sweaters are not super wash. Like these are supposed to be hand washed. And number 4, your washing machine cannot handle a load of a single item. So it has to have those kind of parameters. So I'm wondering how you actually manage it. One of the things that I realized was that I used to have this little mesh lingerie bag that I would use to wash my pantyhose in when I had to do a load of gentles. I haven't worn pantyhose for like 20 years or so I haven't had to wash any of them. And because of the way the top loader worked, I didn't worry about any sweaters that were being washed together, rubbing against each other, or agitating in any way. So I'm trying to figure out how to possibly actually use the wool wash setting on my washing machine where I would have to wash more than one sweater at the same time. So I was thinking that if each sweater were in its own little mesh bag so that they couldn't move around in the bag, and if the bags were getting tossed around in the washer, the bag would be rubbing against another bag, but the sweater itself wouldn't necessarily be rubbing. And I'm wondering if that is the answer, or if some of you are like me and have decided not going to use my front loader washing machine to do any sort of hand washing of non-superwash wool garments. So I'd just like to hear from you. Any of you had that specific experience, and not that you're, because I can't wash and spin a single item. It doesn't work. I did actually try with a sweater that I don't care about. It's like from the 90s. I never wear it, haven't worn it in 25 years. And I washed it and it was okay in the wash setting, but then it could never spin. It could never get past into the rinse cycle and into the spin. It couldn't do it. It was just tossing and tossing and tossing. So I know that it's not going to work with a single item. And the trick is how to make it work with 2 or more items without causing those things to rub against each other and shrink. So any tips? I'd love to hear them. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.